so much. And good afternoon to everyone. And it's a pleasure to present our study, introduction this session. My name is Nicola Bazzoli. I am a research fellow at IRBAP, the Institute of the Evaluation of Public Policies Evaluation at Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento. This work comes from a working paper by me, of course, and a colleague of mine, Sonia Marzadro, and Loris Vergolini from University of Bologna that are here, and Antonio Schizzotto from University of Trento. It's quite obviously what I'm going to talk about today, and the aim of our work is to study, to analyze the possible impact of the Covid-19 pandemic on the Italian students' skills and learning levels, with a specific focus on if the COVID-19 pandemic aggravated the already existing inequalities in educational achievement levels, with a specific focus on students from different social backgrounds. Of course, during the last 2 years, many papers, we can find in literature many papers about this topic. At an international level, it is possible to distinguish between two main branches of literature. The first one focusing on the variations in the learning levels associated to the previous levels of student achievements. And we found many papers with sometimes conflicting results. For example, the majority of results found a decline in educational achievement among students, but we also find an increase in one paper and no variation according to the previous ability of the students. The second branch of literature at international level focusing on the variations in the level of learning loss associated to the students' social origins. And once again, here we can find conflicting results. For example, we have some paper that found an increase in the inequalities, and some other papers that found a reduce in the disparities associated to the social origins. But what about Italy? We have two main papers in Italy about this topic. The first one is a paper by Contini and co-authors. They estimated the effect of the pandemic on the mathematics achievement on primary school of students in the city of Turin. They compare, more precisely, they compare two cohorts of students, one before and one after the COVID. And more precisely, they linked two data sources, the INVALSI test that the students took in grade 2 to a standardized test developed by a researcher in grade 3. And they found that a significant learning loss, so students from COVID cohort underperformed students from non-COVID cohort. And they found a learning loss higher for girls and for high achieving students of low educated parents. A second paper is a paper by Borgonovi and Ferrara. They use INVALSI longitudinal data at population level, and with a difference in differences approach, they estimate the impact of the pandemic on inequalities by gender and by socioeconomic condition, with two different scores of students from primary and lower secondary schools. And they found four main results. The first one is that the learning loss is higher for middle achieving students. The second one is that high achievers benefits more by the pandemic in terms of educational achievement. Thirdly, they found that the gender disparities were broadly reduced except for primary school in mathematics competencies. And finally, they found that the socioeconomic inequalities remains quite stable for students from lower secondary schools and somewhat decreased for students from primary schools. And what about our contribution? We think that we differ from the previous study in Italy because we use an identification strategy that allow us to consider the upper secondary schools. We know we are able to estimate the impact of the COVID on students from higher level of the school system in Italy. The second differential with the other previous studies in Italy is that we analyze not only factors associated to social inequalities, but other three different inequality factors in the educational level of the students. And from a methodological point of view, we use the INVALSI random samples that should be, we should have more reliability than data on the population due to the presence of the external observers during the test administrations. And finally, as I said before, our identification strategy allows us to consider standardized tests in INVALSI that are horizontally anchored. In other words, we can compare standardized tests equivalent from a psychometric point of view, and more precisely, we can compare the average level of achievement of one grade in two different school years. So we can compare directly the average achievement of the students between students from non-COVID cohort and students from COVID cohort. Very quickly, we have 5 main research questions. First of all, what was the overall learning loss that we found in Italy? The second one is about the possible variation according to different grades. The third is what about the learning loss by school subject. The third question is for us the most interesting part of our research is that if we found possible significant intensity in the learning loss according to the individual socioeconomic backgrounds. And finally, we use other 3 inequalities factors that are the macro-geographic area of residence of the students, the migrant status of the students, and the high school track for students from upper secondary schools. So, of course, we use INVALSI data, the national samples for students of grade 5, grade 8, and grade 13 who took the test in the INVALSI test in 2019 and in 2021 for both tests, so for mathematics and reading test. Very quickly, our variable, of course, our outcome variables is a linear transformation of the original INVALSI test. We have standardized this variable, so our results are in terms of standard deviations. We use the ESCS index developed by INVALSI in order to measure the socioeconomic background of the students. Finally, we use these 3 variables in order to assess the intensity of the learning loss associated to the other 3 inequality factors. So, our methods is quite simple. We use a simple before and after comparison. More precisely, we estimate the learning loss in both tests comparing students of grade 5, grade 8, grade 13 who took the INVALSI test in 2021 to their counterparts that who took the test 2 years earlier. Although these cohorts, these two groups, the COVID cohort and non-COVID cohorts, are very close. We could not exclude possible compositional differences in terms of individual characteristics, so we adjusted our estimate with a matching procedure. More precisely, we adopt a personal exit matching. This technique guarantees us a balancing between the two groups, and in particular we adopt this matching procedure because this kind of technique gives us a weight, a CHEM weight, a matching weight that we can insert in our analysis, and more precisely, in order to jointly consider the sampling weights and the CHEM weights, we multiply this kind of weights. And after matching, we estimated two main models. The first one is our baseline model. It is a simply linear model where we control for a set of individual characteristics and for school fixed effect. And our interest parameters is beta, where post is a dummy variable equal to 1 for students from COVID cohort and equal to 0 for students from non-COVID cohort. We estimate this model by school subject and by grade. And in order to answer the last part of our research questions, we added to our baseline model 4 interaction parameters. Interaction parameters between the variable about the membership to at COVID cohort with our 4 variables about the inequality factors. So these guys in blue should measure the variation, the intensity in the learning loss according these 4 inequality factors. We arrive to first results. The first result is about the overall learning loss by grade and by school subject using the baseline model. Simply, the learning loss here is the difference between the predictive scores test in INVALSI for students from COVID cohort minus students from non-COVID cohorts. So, as I said before, we estimate the model by subject and by grade, and we found 3 main things in this table. The first one is that systematically students from COVID cohort underperform students from non-COVID cohort, except for students from grade 5 in reading. The second one is that the intensity of the learning loss is higher for students of upper secondary school than the other grades. And finally, we found that the learning loss is higher in mathematics for the first 2 grades, and it's higher for in reading for the student from upper secondary schools. But what about the size of this effect? Because here is in terms of standard deviation. In order to try to answer these questions, we take advantage from the fact that the World Bank estimated overall achievement growth equal to 0.4 standard deviation. Similar results emerged by a study conducted by OECD on several PISA countries. So with a simple proportion, we try to transform this standard deviation in terms of time. I have a slide in appendix that explains better this proportion, but it's quite simple. And these results, our parameters become this loss of time. It's quite dramatic if we believe in what I do. It's quite dramatic since that students from the upper secondary schools lost about 7 months of 1 school year in reading competencies, and it's very dramatic because we can imagine that a school year in Italy lasts 9 months. So it's almost all the year lost for this kind of students. So here I do the other parameters. Here we added the interaction parameters of the membership to COVID core to our measure of the SES index. And here we found on average that we have no statistically significant parameters except for mathematics ability for grade 8. And in order to understand better what's succeeding in this analysis, we tried to split this variable, the SES index, using the quartile of the SES index. And here we found an interesting point is that overall the parameters are not statistically significant except for first quartile for grade 8. Here seems that if we compare the most and the least privileged students, the difference between these two groups, the inequalities between these two groups seems to widen due to the COVID. I skip this part for lack of time, and now we added the other inequalities factors. For the first line, we found that we have quite homogeneous results about the learning loss. Second one, we found if we look at the migrant status of students, we found seems that the inequalities in educational gaps widen only for first generation of students with respect to native students. And finally, if we look at the high school track for the upper secondary school, we found that we have no significant parameters except for vocational schools. These are very interesting results since that the educational gaps in achievement after the COVID reduced the inequalities in educational achievement between students from vocational comparing to the scientific, I assume. Now, I try to sum up our results very briefly, if I have time. First of all, according to the national and international literature, we have found an overall learning loss among students of every school in both subjects, except for primary schools in reading. The second one result is that the intensity of the reduction in students' achievement seems to increase quite monotonically, moving from the lower to the higher secondary grades. The third result is that the intensity of the learning loss vary according to the school subject. Probably I would leave for the discussion possible explanation of these results. But the most important result for us is that the social and economic inequalities remains quite stable due to the COVID. For us, it's the most important result here. And finally, if we look at the other inequality factors, we found no significant effect. From a policy perspective, what emerged by our analysis is that an entire generation of students is affected by COVID in their level of achievement. And the most it emerged that from our results that the educational needs of students to from 2020-2021 13 graders are the students most affected by the COVID, by the pandemic, in terms of learning loss. And this kind of students have not enough time to recover the learning loss due to the COVID before to enter the labor market or enrolling in tertiary education. So possible suggestions to help this kind of students, two simple possibility. Probably university should implement a set of initiatives like pre-courses before the university, of coaching, of training, in order to limit the risk of dropout of these students. And for those students who decide to enter the labor market after the high school, probably this kind of students should be supported by an intensive and articulated program of vocational and non-vocational training in order to be more competitive than with the workers from other kind of other course of workers. So this is main references about my presentation, and thank you so much for your attention.